The sharp cry of a wounded creature cut through the dense forest, breaking the eerie silence of the late afternoon. Ethan, a young adventurer living near the wilderness, stopped in his tracks. The sound was filled with desperation, a weak howl followed by insistent whimpering echoing through the trees. His pulse quickened as he followed the distressing noise, weaving through the undergrowth until he stumbled upon a heart-wrenching sight. A small gray wolf pup trembling beside its injured mother. The mother wolf lay motionless, her leg caught in a cruel iron trap, her eyes dull with exhaustion and pain. The pup nudged her repeatedly, crying for her to move, but she was too weak to respond. Ethan knew he had no time to waste. Moving cautiously, he knelt beside them. The mother let out a faint growl, a final display of defiance, but she was too weak to resist. Using a nearby stone, Ethan forced the rusted trap open, releasing her mangled leg. The wolf let out a shuddering breath, but she was free. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms while the pup followed close behind, whimpering at his feet. With determined steps, he carried them both back to his cabin, knowing that this was just the beginning of their journey. What happened next would change everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more powerful and emotional stories like this to you. The sun hung low in the sky as Ethan trekked through the vast backcountry near his home. He was no stranger to the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to find. As he paused near a small clearing, a faint sound drifted toward him. A high-pitched whimper, barely audible over the wind. He froze. What was that? Scanning the trees, he followed the sound, his boots crunching against the forest floor. The cries grew louder until, beneath the thick roots of an old oak, he saw them. A tiny gray wolf pup, barely a few weeks old, was curled against its unmoving mother. Its frail body shook with every whimper as it nudged her side in vain. Ethan's breath hitched. The mother's fur was matted with blood, her chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths. She was still alive, but barely. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He knew the rules of the wild. He had seen enough documentaries to understand that nature had its own ways. But this wasn't just any scene. This was suffering. And he couldn't turn away. He knelt beside them, slowly reaching out. The pup didn't react, too weak to resist, but the mother's golden eyes flickered open. A soft, warning growl vibrated in her chest, but it was feeble, lacking strength. Ethan spoke gently. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help. The mother's gaze lingered on him, her breath slowing. It was as if, in that moment, she understood. She had no fight left. Steeling himself, Ethan reached for the rusted metal trap that held her. With effort, he pried it open, freeing her mangled leg. The wolf let out a heavy, ragged breath. Blood seeped from the deep gash in her leg, staining the snow beneath her. She whimpered in pain but made no effort to move. Now there was no turning back. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms, feeling the weight of her fragile body. The pup let out a small yelp, stumbling forward on unsteady legs. Ethan glanced down. All right, little one, let's go home. The journey back to his cabin was grueling. The weight of the mother wolf strained his arms, and the pup struggled to keep up, occasionally tumbling into the snow. Ethan had to stop several times, adjusting his grip and coaxing the exhausted pup forward. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature was dropping fast. He knew they couldn't stop for long. By the time they reached the cabin, Ethan's breath was ragged, his muscles aching. He kicked open the door and carefully placed the mother wolf near the fireplace. The pup immediately scrambled onto the wooden floor and nestled against her, shivering. Ethan quickly grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around the frail animal, then rushed to grab his medical kit. He had no veterinary experience, but he had basic first aid knowledge. Taking a deep breath, he cleaned the wound as best as he could, flinching as the mother wolf whimpered in pain. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, but she was too weak to resist. Ethan wrapped her leg carefully with strips of cloth, ensuring that the bleeding slowed. He then turned to the pup, who was staring up at him with wide, golden eyes. "You're safe now," Ethan murmured, reaching out to stroke its tiny head. The pup hesitated, but eventually pressed its nose against his hand, a small sign of trust. As the fire crackled, warmth slowly filled the cabin. Ethan sat back, watching the two wolves. He had done what he could for now, but he knew the real challenge had just begun. Tomorrow, he would have to find food. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out what to do next. Ethan awoke to the sound of soft whimpers. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. The cabin was cold, but not as cold as the fragile creatures he had rescued. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and turned his attention to the mother wolf. She remained still, her breaths shallow but steady. The pup lay curled against her, its tiny chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Ethan moved cautiously, kneeling beside them. He reached out, fingers grazing the mother's fur. She flinched, but made no effort to move away. The pup, however, opened its golden eyes, staring at him with something between curiosity and fear. "I guess you're still here," Ethan whispered. He checked the bandages around the mother's leg. Blood had seeped through, but the bleeding had slowed. That was a good sign. However, she needed proper nourishment if she was going to stand a chance at surviving. His stomach growled, reminding him that he too had gone nearly a day without eating. Rising to his feet, he moved toward the small pantry. Supplies were limited. Living alone in the woods meant rationing carefully, but this situation required something more. He grabbed a piece of dried meat and debated. Would she even eat? Cautiously, he tore a small piece and placed it near her snout. The mother wolf sniffed weakly, but did not move. Ethan frowned. This was worse than he thought. If she refused to eat, her body might shut down before she had a chance to heal. Desperate, he turned to the pup. It whined softly, its eyes darting between him and its mother. He placed another small piece of food in front of the pup. Unlike its mother, the pup hesitated only briefly before sniffing and taking tentative bites. A wave of relief washed over Ethan. At least one of them was eating. After ensuring they were settled, Ethan grabbed his coat. If they were going to survive, he needed more supplies: food, fresh water, and maybe something for the mother's wound. He wasn't a vet, but he had seen enough injuries on wild animals to know that infection could be fatal. He hesitated at the door, glancing back. The pup had finished eating and curled into a tight ball next to its mother. The mother wolf, though weak, opened her eyes just slightly. For the first time, their gazes met, not in fear, but in silent acknowledgement. "I'll be back," Ethan promised. Then, with one last look, he stepped into the snow-covered forest. The air was crisp, each breath forming misty clouds in the cold morning light. He moved quickly, scanning for signs of fresh tracks. If he was lucky, he could catch something small, enough to sustain them for another day or two. After nearly an hour of tracking, he spotted movement near a fallen tree. A rabbit. His heart pounded as he readied his bow. He wasn't a professional hunter, but he had learned enough to survive. He pulled the string back, exhaling slowly, before releasing the arrow. The shot hit true. By the time he returned, the sun had climbed higher, melting the thin layer of frost that had settled overnight. He stepped inside, shaking off the cold. The pup's ears perked up, and it let out a tiny bark, its first sign of energy. Ethan smiled. "Missed me already?" He set to work preparing the meat, cooking some for himself while setting aside raw portions for the wolves. When he placed the fresh meat near the mother's snout again, she sniffed. This time, her nose twitched with interest. Slowly, weakly, she opened her jaws and took a bite. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She was fighting. She wanted to live. That night, as the fire crackled once more, Ethan sat watching the two wolves. The mother had eaten, and the pup had nestled closer to her, its tiny body pressing into her warmth. For the first time since finding them, Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Hope. Ethan awoke to the sound of faint movement. The crackling of the fire had faded to a whisper, and the cold air from outside seeped through the wooden walls of the cabin. He sat up slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim morning light filtering through the frosted windows. His first instinct was to check on the wolves. The pup was nestled tightly against its mother's side, its tiny body rising and falling with each peaceful breath. The mother wolf, however, was awake. Her golden eyes were open, locked onto Ethan, observing his every move with a mixture of exhaustion and wariness. For the first time since he had rescued them, she was fully alert. Ethan held still, not wanting to startle her. The tension in the room was thick, neither of them quite sure what would happen next. He knew that despite her injuries, she was still a wild animal. He had to be careful. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The wolf didn't respond, but she didn't growl either. That was progress. Ethan slowly reached for a piece of raw meat he had set aside the night before. He placed it on a small wooden plate and slid it closer to her. The mother wolf's ears flicked, and for a moment she didn't move. Then, cautiously, she sniffed the air. The scent of fresh meat seemed to trigger her survival instincts, and after another tense pause, she stretched her neck forward and took a bite. Ethan exhaled in relief. It wasn't full trust, but it was a start. The pup stirred at the movement and yawned, its tiny mouth opening wide before it turned its sleepy eyes toward Ethan. It let out a small whimper before stumbling to its feet, trotting toward him on wobbly legs. Ethan chuckled. "You're getting brave, huh?" The pup nosed at his knee, then looked up expectantly. Ethan reached out a hesitant hand, allowing the pup to sniff his fingers before gently stroking its soft fur. The pup wagged its tiny tail, pressing closer. The mother wolf tensed slightly, but didn't intervene. She simply watched, her golden eyes following every movement with careful attention. Over the next few days, Ethan and the wolves settled into a cautious routine. Each morning, he left the cabin to hunt, gathering small game and whatever edible plants he could find. Each time he returned, the mother wolf seemed slightly less guarded. She still kept her distance, but she no longer bared her teeth or growled when he moved nearby. One evening, as Ethan sat near the fire, the mother wolf made her first real choice of trust. She stood slowly, testing the strength of her injured leg, and then, with careful movements, she limped closer to him. She stopped just a few feet away, her gaze locked onto his. Ethan didn't move. He barely breathed. Then, to his surprise, she lowered herself onto the floor beside the fire, sighing heavily as she rested. The pup, overjoyed, bounced toward Ethan, placing its small paws on his lap. Ethan smiled. Guess we're making progress. That night, as the fire burned bright and warm, something unspoken passed between them. A silent understanding, a fragile alliance. They were no longer just a man and two wolves. They were something more. Days passed, and the once fragile connection between Ethan and the wolves continued to grow. The mother wolf, though still injured, had begun to regain some of her strength. Her leg remained weak, but she was no longer just surviving. She was healing. She now ate without hesitation, her sharp eyes tracking Ethan's every movement, not with fear, but with something resembling curiosity. Ethan had always been comfortable alone. His life near the wilderness had been one of solitude by choice. But now, for the first time in a long while, his cabin was not just his own. The wolves had become an undeniable presence in his life. One evening, as Ethan sat by the fire, the pup wrestled clumsily with a small piece of wood, biting and pawing at it with boundless energy. The mother watched closely, her ears flicking toward every sudden movement, but she made no effort to stop the pup from playing near Ethan. Ethan smirked, watching the tiny creature tumble over itself. "You've got some fight in you," he said, reaching out. The pup eagerly bounced toward his hand, licking at his fingers with an affection that caught Ethan off guard. But then, a sudden sound outside shattered the peace. A deep, guttural howl echoed through the trees. The mother wolf's head snapped up instantly, her ears rigid, her muscles tensed. The pup whimpered and scrambled to her side. Ethan felt his own chest tighten. He recognized that sound. It wasn't just any wolf. It was a call for a lost member of the pack. The mother wolf shifted, her body quivering with tension. For the first time, Ethan saw something new in her eyes. Conflict. She wanted to go. She needed to go. Ethan swallowed hard, staring at her. "Your family's looking for you." The weight of reality settled on him. He had saved her life. He had nursed her back from the brink of death. But she wasn't his to keep. Another howl rang out, this time closer. The mother wolf took a shaky step forward, then hesitated, glancing at Ethan. The pup, sensing the shift, whined and buried its face against her fur. Ethan exhaled slowly, If you need to go, I won't stop you." The mother wolf didn't move right away. Instead, she stepped toward Ethan, closer than ever before. For a moment, she just stood there, her golden eyes locked onto his. Then, to his absolute shock, she lowered her head slightly, a gesture of silent gratitude. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her thick fur. "Go find them," he whispered. "They're waiting for you." With one last glance at Ethan, the mother wolf turned and limped toward the door. The pup whimpered, hesitating before trotting after her. Ethan opened the door, the freezing wind rushing in as the forest stretched before them. The mother wolf took a deep breath, then lifted her head and howled, a powerful, longing call. And then, from the darkness, the answer came. A series of distant howls responded in unison, growing closer. Ethan stood frozen as multiple golden eyes appeared in the tree line, glowing in the moonlight. A pack, her pack, had been waiting all along. The mother wolf turned to Ethan one last time before stepping forward into the night. The pup hesitated for only a moment longer before following. Ethan watched as they disappeared into the wilderness, their figures blending with the shadows of the forest. A silence settled over the cabin. The fire crackled, the warmth of its glow contrasting with the empty space beside him. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan realized what it meant to truly let go. The night after the wolves disappeared into the forest, Ethan sat by the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames. The cabin, once filled with cautious movements and quiet sounds of healing, now felt hollow. The absence of the wolves was almost too loud. He had done the right thing. He knew that. But why did it feel like something inside him had been taken away? He leaned back against his chair, running a hand through his hair. His body still carried the tension from the past weeks, watching over the mother wolf, feeding the pup, ensuring their survival. Now, that energy had nowhere to go. His eyes drifted toward the door. He imagined them still out there, moving through the darkness, their golden eyes scanning the terrain, finally where they belonged. But a lingering thought gnawed at him. Would they survive? The mother wolf was still weak. Though she had grown stronger, her leg was far from fully healed. Had he let her go too soon? And what about the pup? It was still so small, so vulnerable. Had he condemned them by letting them return to the wild? He let out a frustrated sigh and stood up. He needed air. Stepping outside, the cold wind bit at his skin. The snow-covered trees swayed under the weight of winter's breath. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs, but it did nothing to soothe the ache in his chest. Then, a sound, a soft rustling in the trees. His heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching. But there was nothing. Just the whisper of the wind moving through the branches. He cursed under his breath. He was imagining things. He needed to let go. But as he turned back toward the cabin, he hesitated. In the snow, barely visible beneath the moonlight, were fresh paw prints. His stomach twisted. He knelt, touching the indentations in the snow. They were small, too small to belong to the mother wolf. His pulse quickened. The pup. Ethan's head shot up, eyes darting toward the woods. Was it still here? Had it gotten lost? The thought sent a wave of panic through him. If the pup had been separated from its mother, it wouldn't survive long on its own. He rose to his feet, scanning the trees, listening intently. "Hello?" His voice barely carried against the wind. Silence. Then, a soft whimper. Ethan's chest tightened. He turned sharply toward the sound, and there, at the edge of the forest, barely visible through the shadows, stood the small gray pup. Its fur was ruffled from the wind, its golden eyes wide, reflecting the light from the cabin. It didn't move. It just stared at him, its tiny body trembling. Ethan's heart pounded. "You came back," he whispered. The pup whimpered again, but didn't step forward. It was afraid, lost, conflicted. Ethan crouched low, extending his hand. "Come here, little one. It's okay." The pup hesitated, shifting its small paws in the snow. Then, with a cautious step, it moved forward. Slowly at first, then faster, until it was running straight into Ethan's arms. He caught it, cradling the small creature against his chest. The pup buried its face against his jacket, its tiny body trembling not from the cold, but from exhaustion. Ethan exhaled shakily, a wave of relief washing over him. He ran his fingers gently through the pup's fur. "You didn't want to leave, did you?" The pup let out a small, contented sigh, pressing closer. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, holding the pup tighter. He had thought his journey with the wolves had ended. He had believed that letting them go was the final chapter. But fate had other plans. As he carried the pup back inside, he realized something. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about family. Ethan sat in front of the fireplace, the pup curled against his chest, its tiny breaths steady against the fabric of his jacket. He stroked its soft fur absent-mindedly, lost in thought. He had spent weeks preparing the wolves for survival, only to have one return to him. The pup had chosen him, and now he had a decision to make. Would he try to return the pup to the wild, or would he take responsibility for the life that had placed its trust in him? The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Ethan looked down at the pup. "You shouldn't be here, you know," he murmured, but there was no firmness in his voice. The pup's ears twitched, but it remained nestled in his arms, warm and safe. Ethan sighed, leaning his head back against the chair. He had always been a man of solitude, choosing the wilderness over human companionship. But this little creature had carved its way into his life, and now the idea of letting it go again filled him with unease. Morning came with the soft golden glow of the winter sun spilling through the frosted windows. The pup stirred, letting out a tiny yawn before stretching its small legs. Ethan watched as it clumsily tumbled off his lap, landing on the wooden floor before scrambling to its feet. It looked up at him expectantly. All right," Ethan muttered, standing. "I suppose you're hungry." He walked to the small kitchen, preparing what little food he had left that was suitable for the pup. He tore small pieces of meat and placed them in a dish, setting it down in front of the wolf. It hesitated, looking up at him as if for approval before slowly eating. Ethan sat down, watching as the pup devoured its meal. "You eat like you've been starving for days," Ethan commented. Did your mother send you back? Or did you just decide you liked the warm cabin better?" The pup finished eating and sat down, tilting its head at him. Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I can't keep you forever, you know. You belong out there, with them." But deep down, he wasn't sure he believed his own words. Later that day, Ethan decided to take the pup outside. It had spent the night in his arms, but he knew he couldn't keep it locked away. If it truly belonged in the wild, it had to find its own way back. The forest was quiet as Ethan walked toward the tree line, the pup trotting close by his boots. Its tiny paws left imprints in the fresh snow, its nose twitching as it took in the scents of the wild. They reached the edge of the woods, and Ethan stopped. He crouched down, rubbing the pup's head gently. "All right, little one. If you want to go, this is your chance. Your family might be out there, waiting for you." The pup looked up at him, its golden eyes filled with something unreadable. Then it turned toward the trees. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat as he watched it take a few hesitant steps forward. Then, suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence. A deep, familiar howl. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew that sound. The mother wolf. The pup's ears perked up, and for a moment it hesitated. Then, as if recognizing the call, it let out a small yelp and ran toward the trees. Ethan stood there, watching as the tiny creature disappeared into the wild. His chest tightened, but he knew it was the right thing to do. But just as he turned to head back to the cabin, a rustling sound made him stop. He whipped around, scanning the trees. Then he saw them. The mother wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes locked onto his. She was still weak, but she was standing strong, her breath visible in the cold air. Beside her, the pup bounded happily to her side. For a moment, mother and child reunited. Then, the mother wolf turned her gaze back to Ethan. There was something in her eyes. Not fear, not wariness, but something else. A silent acknowledgement. Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, with one last glance, the mother wolf let out a final, deep howl before turning and vanishing into the forest, the pup right behind her. Ethan stood in the snow, his breath hitching in his chest. They were gone. But this time, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a promise kept. The forest was silent again, the wind whispering through the pines as Ethan stood alone at the tree line. The mother wolf and her pup had vanished into the wilderness, their golden eyes the last trace of them he would ever see. He had done what he set out to do. He had saved them. He had given them another chance at life. And yet, as he turned back toward his cabin, the weight of their absence settled deep in his chest. His boots crunched over the snow, each step slower than the last. The world felt different now, as if a piece of him had left with them. He had always been someone who found solace in solitude, yet in the weeks he had spent with the wolves, something had shifted. He had been needed, relied upon in a way he never had before. And now, with that purpose fulfilled, there was only the quiet once more. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Ethan knelt before it, adding more logs, watching as the embers flared and cracked. The warmth spread through the space, but it did little to ease the lingering ache in his chest. He looked toward the spot where the pup had slept, the blankets still slightly rumpled from its tiny body. It had been here for such a short time, yet it had left an imprint that would never fade. Ethan reached out, smoothing the fabric with his fingers. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Days passed, and though the forest had returned to its usual rhythms, Ethan found himself listening, always listening, for the distant sound of a howl. He went about his routines, chopping wood, hunting for food, preparing for the harsh winter ahead. But something inside him had changed. One evening, as he sat outside watching the sun dip below the treetops, he heard it. A single, deep howl. His breath caught in his throat. He turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. It was distant, carried by the wind, but unmistakable. It was her. A slow smile spread across his face, and for the first time since their departure, he felt something other than loss. They were out there. They had survived. And maybe, just maybe, they hadn't forgotten him either. Later that day, Ethan decided to take the pup outside. It had spent the night in his arms, but he knew he couldn't keep it locked away. If it truly belonged in the wild, it had to find its own way back. The forest was quiet as Ethan walked toward the tree line, the pup trotting close by his boots. Its tiny paws left imprints in the fresh snow, its nose twitching as it took in the scents of the wild. They reached the edge of the woods, and Ethan stopped. He crouched down, rubbing the pup's head gently. "All right, little one. If you want to go, this is your chance. Your family might be out there, waiting for you." The pup looked up at him, its golden eyes filled with something unreadable. Then it turned toward the trees. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat as he watched it take a few hesitant steps forward. Then, suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence. A deep, familiar howl. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew that sound. The mother wolf. The pup's ears perked up, and for a moment it hesitated. Then, as if recognizing the call, it let out a small yelp and ran toward the trees. Ethan stood there, watching as the tiny creature disappeared into the wild. His chest tightened, but he knew it was the right thing to do. But just as he turned to head back to the cabin, a rustling sound made him stop. He whipped around, scanning the trees. Then he saw them. The mother wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes locked onto his. She was still weak, but she was standing strong, her breath visible in the cold air. Beside her, the pup bounded happily to her side. For a moment, mother and child reunited. Then, the mother wolf turned her gaze back to Ethan. There was something in her eyes. Not fear, not wariness, but something else. A silent acknowledgement. Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, with one last glance, the mother wolf let out a final, deep howl before turning and vanishing into the forest, the pup right behind her. Ethan stood in the snow, his breath hitching in his chest. They were gone. But this time, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a promise kept. The forest was silent again, the wind whispering through the pines as Ethan stood alone at the tree line. The mother wolf and her pup had vanished into the wilderness. their golden eyes the last trace of them he would ever see. He had done what he set out to do. He had saved them. He had given them another chance at life. And yet, as he turned back toward his cabin, the weight of their absence settled deep in his chest. His boots crunched over the snow, each step slower than the last. The world felt different now, as if a piece of him had left with them. He had always been someone who found solace in solitude, yet in the weeks he had spent with the wolves, something had shifted. He had been needed, relied upon in a way he never had before. And now, with that purpose fulfilled, there was only the quiet once more. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Ethan knelt before it, adding more logs, watching as the embers flared and cracked. The warmth spread through the space, but it did little to ease the lingering ache in his chest. He looked toward the spot where the pup had slept, the blankets still slightly rumpled from its tiny body. It had been here for such a short time, yet it had left an imprint that would never fade. Ethan reached out, smoothing the fabric with his fingers. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Days passed, and though the forest had returned to its usual rhythms, Ethan found himself listening, always listening, for the distant sound of a howl. He went about his routines, chopping wood, hunting for food, preparing for the harsh winter ahead. But something inside him had changed. One evening, as he sat outside watching the sun dip below the treetops, he heard it. A single, deep howl. His breath caught in his throat. He turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. It was distant, carried by the wind, but unmistakable. It was her. A slow smile spread across his face, and for the first time since their departure, he felt something other than loss. They were out there. They had survived. And maybe, just maybe, they hadn't forgotten him either. The seasons changed, the snow deepening and the cold growing harsher. Ethan continued his life as he always had, but now it felt different. He was no longer just surviving in the wilderness. He was part of it in a way he had never been before. Occasionally, he would find fresh tracks near the tree line, wolf tracks. He never saw them, but he knew they were there, watching, checking in. And in the middle of the night, when the wind howled through the mountains, he would sometimes hear it, the song of the wild calling out beneath the moon. He would close his eyes and listen, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The wolves had come into his life as an accident, a twist of fate, but they had left him with something far greater than he could have ever imagined. A connection, a purpose, a reminder that no one, not even the most solitary of souls, was ever truly alone. If this story touched your heart, remember, compassion and courage can create ripples that last a lifetime. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who believes in the power of connection and the beauty of the wild.